not every day you get the opportunity to speak to such an amazing bunch of people. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to the first question on this, and I'm going to address this to you, Lucy, if you don't mind. Please tell us why you consider clinical research important and what inspires and motivates you to improve the experience for patients based on your own experience.
Well, I think there's an obvious answer to that. Firstly, is to be able to bring the right treatments to the right patients and make them available through our healthcare systems. But then I think also, just from my experience, the support that clinical trials actually provide certain patient groups, it needs to be better, but there is a very good experience on some patients. And what motivates me to make it a better experience is being able to, my first-hand experience of seeing how certain patients did have a very good experience on clinical trials and how it can be made better for all patients.
Excellent. Joe, we spoke earlier before the meeting about why you feel, particularly within the Usher syndrome community, there is an issue with what patients know, or more importantly, what they fear about clinical trials. Well, can you expand on that a little bit? Why do you think people with your condition fear clinical trials?
Well, what I can say is that patients with Usher syndrome, there seems to be, I've always said there seems to be the people there and the people at the bottom will tend to be like the patient, and there seems to be no like link in communication. Now, if you were to talk to anybody with Usher syndrome, it's the same with any rare disease, everybody wants a cure or they want treatment. That is like the main hope for everybody. Everybody shares the same pattern. Yes, there seems to be like a very negative feeling about clinical trial. Everybody wants to take part of it, but there's like a fear of the unknown. Now, for me, I would say that there had to be a more human approach, and there had to be more of like an empathy and understanding, because it's very well somebody being an expert in the field, but there seems to be a lack of communication. That is like a huge thing. And I know it sounds very, very basic, what I'm actually saying, but it is a very, very big problem. Now, this is something that only happened a few months ago, and I won't mention any names, but there was a company which got in touch with just relevant people in the Usher syndrome community, and they were offering X amount of pounds to take part in like a clinical trial. And there was a lot of complaint about it because it seemed to be like a very cold-hearted approach, because so much money had been raised, because this is like another aspect of what I do, that we do lots of funding, we do lots of fundraising, and quite a lot of money gets into the pot, if you like. And then there seems to be somebody that's spoiling it by just sending like emails and just asking people to come forward. So there's definitely like a big gap in the middle.
Charlie, how do you, as somebody involved from a surgical point of view, how does that make you feel as a surgeon with the kind of the disconnect that Joe mentioned? Is that something that you've experienced yourself?
Well, I'm disappointed, I have to say, hearing that. And it's not something I've experienced myself or ever had a complaint about, I have to say. I think within my own team, I think we try to be empathetic to patients. Certainly the nurses who work with me spend a great deal of time communicating with patients and trying to make them feel at ease in clinical studies. So I would be disappointed to hear that. I think the point you make about the them and us is a relevant one. I mean, that's a problem with medicine. But people like me, sometimes, you know, maybe we are the them and the patients are the us. We certainly don't intend it to seem that way. And obviously, in terms of moving forwards with trials, we have to prevent that. You know, this has to be about engagement, and the document that's been written on this, you know, pays a lot of attention to that in terms of the future for clinical trials, and not a them and us situation.
Jenny, you're nodding there. So you clearly agree with what Charles said. What's your view on this? Do you feel there's a disconnect?
I think there's a total disconnect between healthcare and research, and I think that people are so fearful of crossing that when actually it's already crossed.
Yeah.
But people just don't realise it, and there's still that guinea pig image of research happening, and in the field of paediatrics even more so. Parents don't feel as if they have enough knowledge and experience to be able to allow their children to take part, which is an even bigger responsibility because you're given consent for your child to take part. So I think there's still that big disconnect, and I've been in this field now for 14 years and it's still a big problem.
Isn't this something you've come across as well, Mark?
Yeah, I think the perception is something we always talk about, that there's, and I think sort of touched on with the kind of people approaching you by email, that the public, and certainly, so I've been in this industry about 10 years, but before that I didn't really know what a clinical trial was, and I think I had the same perception most people did, which is it's what you read in the newspaper, which is something going wrong or someone getting paid a few grand to go and take a few risks aimed at students, and kind of the whole phase 2, 3 where there's real people being helped and getting access to drugs and treatments that they need wasn't something that I was aware of. And I think often if you're informed by the newspapers, you're not necessarily getting the best version of events. Their job is to promote the worst version of events. And I think the pharma industry is naturally secretive. There's lots of kind of proprietary things that people are trying to protect. And I think partly that's contributed to an industry that's kind of, its awareness and its perception is driven by the media, which means most people have a skewed perception of what it is. And it was only really when I kind of started to get into the industry that I was kind of like, this is the only way that we get treatments to people. It's so critical, but how is there's this perception with it? And even I find today that we speak to healthcare professionals all around the world, and yeah, I find GPs don't believe in clinical research, and that it's not something they should recommend. And it's kind of like, but so much of what you do is relying on the outputs of clinical research. I kind of find that whole perception, it runs throughout, and I think it's something that we need to tackle.
I'm going to come to Jeff next, because Jeff, obviously you have been at the centre or to publicity over the years as a footballer. Do you actually feel that as a patient, with your patient hat on, you get treated the same in the clinical trials sphere?
I only can talk from the Blood Cancer Network. I think because the relationship between the clinicians and professors and the science is so close, there is a closeness between the guy you're being treated by and the patient. And I think we are a bit of a shining example with clinical trials. I think we've sort of experienced 15 years ago where there was just no clinical research nurses in position to allow this wealth of science that's been built up over the last 20 years to benefit patients. So it was just a lack of infrastructure. And I think patients have a real power in telling their stories and helping this work accelerate. And that's what it's all about, acceleration, because as a patient you experience really negative stories. You see that all the time with people that you sat next to because they don't have the same opportunity, because they lived in a different area. Yep. And they get treatment too late. But what we've experienced is that we've put in a system that puts an umbrella over a number of hospitals that gives us enough population to do early phase clinical trials on, later clinical trials on. And it's working, and that's what we need to get out to different areas, because there is this old Will Carlin phrase, there is an old fart syndrome sort of thing that we had to push through. And there is, and it is frustrating, you know, especially where we're at, because we are really motoring on.
Vernon, I see you scribbling away there.
I am. Just drawing.
No, drawing. What's your particular? Is there a disconnect? Or is
There's lots of disconnects here. I think there's a few things that are starting to come through that people are talking about that are themes. Science and medicine, and particularly clinical trials, can be regarded as sterile. Guinea pig, you said. So patients, when you're ill, you hear somebody say trial, you hear uncertainty. One hears guinea pig, lab rat. Whereas actually we need to build trust, relationships with people, and you said it, Joe, empathy. So yes, we want to be getting the right evidence, but each one of those points of evidence is a person. And we have to treat them as a person, not as a lab rat. So fundamentally, it's about how you would want to be treated within that. I know patients that don't want to be on placebo-controlled trials because they want to be on a treatment. So this is about expectations and about relationships and trust, and taking people, getting them ready, getting them prepared, and moving them along. How do we expect people to stay on trials for years sometimes, right? When they don't have any feedback. They don't know where they are, how they're getting on. They don't know how others are getting on. We're pack animals. Human beings are pack animals. So we need to learn from some of these more human approaches to communicating, but do it in a way that allows us to get high quality data. I know you two particularly will be looking at the quality of the data, but only as long as we can measure the effectiveness of the communication and how it's engaging and activating people.
But I think, to be fair though, once you're on a trial, the majority of people have a really good experience and would be able to have, you know, a really good story to tell. It's those who have never really considered or know much about clinical trials to begin with, and children fall into that category. To give them the power to take part in research is a completely different kettle of fish. But I think my mums of this world still consider, and she's on all sorts of tablets, but she would still consider that's somebody else's business to do the clinical trial. But if she was a part of a clinical trial, I don't think you'd be able to get her out of any trials because I know she would be treated, you know, with utmost respect, and so I think it's once you've been a part of that trial, I think there's a different story being told.
But you're touching on two things there. I mean, you're touching on experience, the experiential component, and also the literacy part. Do you know what it is that you're involved with and why?
Charlie, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff touched on this. I mean, the way the infrastructure is organised now, there are actually 3 levels of this, aren't there? There are the people like me, or like a pharma company, or me and a pharma. I mean, I don't actually do pharma trials, but if I did, I might engage in the design of a trial with a pharma company. And then in a way, we have delegated to a set of proxies, research nurses, clinicians, general practitioners, the people on the shop floor, the authority to actually interact with the patient. It's not me interacting with the patient in a multi-centre study. Now, I can speak for my own practice where I do my own research, where I do the operation and other things, and there I would like to think the empathy level is very high. But we are reliant on having a skilled workforce of people who are between the designer and the sponsor of a study and the patient. And we rely on those people being empathetic and making that interaction.
Bruce, you wanted to come in there, didn't you, earlier on?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously a whole breadth of research that may go on. There's obviously the clinical phase studies, but later phase research as well. And one nice example, we worked with the University of Manchester on a very exciting project that recruited people just from the general population with chronic pain and rheumatoid arthritis. And we were posing people the question, does the weather affect your pain? A really human question. We had 13,500 people sign up. It was a nice study name called Cloudy with a Chance of Pain, but very human, isn't it? It's a human question, a human thing, but the people taking part, using their own devices, capturing all their data, and choosing to donate it, obviously consented, choosing to donate their data, they felt that not only were they taking more control of their health and understanding how they're getting on, they really valued donating their data and being kept up to date. And I think what's quite interesting is the opportunity in this completely virtual trial setting and real world to learn a lot and then bring some of that back into the clinical phase studies. Because I don't think it makes so much sense nowadays to bring a patient in every single time when they can do some of the stuff at home. Now, some people want to come in, and that's part of a trial experience, but many people don't want to take a day off work just to come in and fill out some forms. So I think the future, thinking about the person, first of all, not the research data set, will make a really big difference.
And I think to that point, I think a lot of the time the design is almost blinded by the objective. Is going, God, I need to get 18 to 34-year-olds with this condition. I need 400 of them. And so that's what they go for. Are like, are you within this range? Are you at this site? Are you available? And they forget to think about it from the point of, I'm looking for that person, and ask those really people-centric questions. Think about, do they want to come in? Should we be going to them? Is there other ways of doing it? There was that lovely example, I think it was Alzheimer's Foundation, where they looked at the fact that the biggest barrier for getting people to recruit was that it was difficult to come into the hospital, and they partnered with Lyft, you know, the kind of Uber-style taxi service, to bring them in. And suddenly the very, very simple change allows you to create a much more seamless experience and get people signed up a lot quicker. So I think you're 100% right. Instead of thinking of the objective of the design, think about the people that you're trying to bring in. Makes a huge difference.
And that you mentioned the difference sometimes between healthcare and research. I mean, in a sense, it's ridiculous because it's still the person. The person is on the trial, the person's receiving care. And I think that's the flip on the patient-centric approach is I should be able to take part in a trial and see my doctor and go to see my physio in the gym or whatever, but make it around me, not those artificial divides.
Christian, I haven't heard much from you, and the reason is because I've been directing conversations elsewhere, and I apologise. I apologise for that. But, so, why do you consider clinical research important, and what inspires, motivates you?
Well, for me, the most obvious answer is that we can't advance medical science without clinical trials. So I see no better reason, because we all want better healthcare and we all want to live longer, but also have good quality of life within our time on this planet. And so for me, that's my main motivation, is that if we can improve the process, then hopefully we can expedite our advances in medical technology. On the flip side of that is that it's almost a shame in some ways that people have to play their part in the clinical trials, because with side effects and different problems, emotional challenges they go through, the experiences that we're sharing, it's not always the greatest experience, even though during clinical trials people are respected and we try and do the best for them. And it's almost a shame that humans have to be involved, but they do. So if that's status quo and we want to advance medical science, then we have to make the patient experience as good as we can, so that we're getting the best medical advance that we can, but with as little collateral damage in the process.
I'm just going to read some facts to you, which I know some of you will be familiar with. 40 million patients are needed for over 300,000 clinical trials. What did a panel feel are some of the barriers that are stopping people signing up to these clinical trials? And I'll start off by, Lucy, you put your hand up.
Yeah, well, I just think from my perspective, where I was actually recruiting patients through clinics, in my previous role, the reason that a lot of these things don't happen is they're trying to get through the admin side of trying to get these clinical trials open in time for the time that the trial actually closes. There was countless times where we would get trials trying to go through R&D to get contracts signed just for the day later for the trial to close globally and you couldn't recruit anyone, or you're recruiting one patient. And not only that, the proximity to the research facility. We were only ever recruiting people who were in a 2-hour drive to Manchester. So there's so many more people who could benefit from the trials that we were providing if people across the whole of the United Kingdom knew about the trial. Yep. But the only way they knew about the trial was being passed. One of the nurses I worked with would make a little leaflet, and that would get passed to primary care physicians to then tell the patients that come through their clinic to be passed on through the specialist. So there's a disconnect of trying to communicate to all patients to be able to get to know about the clinical trials on offer.
Is that something that resonates? It clearly is.
I just seriously think there's not enough information about accessing clinical trials for patients. I seriously don't think so. I mean, if you walk in all the active research trusts in the UK, you try and find anything about research that's taken place is very minimal within trusts, or
it's all in the
it's all in the background, or it's people who are already involved in trials get asked how their experience is, but no, if you're walking through a trust, You know, where's that information? Who can you ask?
Yeah.
You know, it's just minimal information.
Jenny, I can build on that because I actually worked in a hospital running a clinical trial without knowing that a clinical trial was being run. So how the patients are supposed to know that they could possibly put their hand up and ask for information, I don't know.
But that sort of talks to the fact that we fail the public as a whole because of the lack of health literacy, and that we're all consumers of healthcare, even the healthcare providers and everybody else is part of the system. And research and understanding and gathering it should be part of that contract and part of the health system provision. We need to normalise that and not have it being an end point for those that are just sick enough or just accessible or eligible. There's a massive piece that we need to take with the general public on of what healthcare provision is and what we need to improve it and keep it optimising it along the way.
And making it normal that how many of us are wearing Fitbits or tracking our runs and our cycle rides on Strava and capturing all of that data. You know, we're all being research participants for ourselves, and making that as a normalised thing, that actually that is rich data that maybe it's not as high quality as some other stuff, but making it a normal thing that every person, every patient should be a research participant of some sort. It doesn't mean a phase 2 clinical trial.
Yeah,
I think people get scared of giving what they think is personal to them data.
Yeah.
They've got a phone that more or less tells everybody where you are, and it's got all the information on there. You give your credit card information over there, you give your 3 little secret numbers over to buy a pair of socks. But then there's these news scare stories that go out about you're giving up your data. And that's what we need to break down. There needs to be good news stories where data is being used in a positive way. And the only way of doing that is keep banging a drum. You can't give up on this. And I think it's natural, I think, for people to, we've mentioned already, bad news stories make news rather than good news stories. And I think that's where we have to change it in the medical system. We need to keep saying what's happening that's great in the NHS, because it is a fabulous institution, but we're not using it properly. And there's a great opportunity of changing things very quickly. And I think, I keep going back to what we're actually doing now. We've actually brought in 13 centres now together from Glasgow down to Southampton. We've got a couple of centres here in London, Birmingham, Manchester. And like you say, there'll be patients that want a clinical trial, and they're probably too far away if it was just one centre. But the way we're doing it, where it's spread all over the country, with one person leading that, then all that information spreads all around the country, but all that data goes back to one place where it accelerates all this knowledge, and so you can accelerate trials. We've leveraged £120 million worth of free drugs into the NHS because we've proved the system from being 5 years to 10 years to get a trial through, we can do it to 2 to 3 years. So, but nobody knows about it, but they will, because we have to do stupid things to raise money to highlight what we're doing. And it is frustrating as a patient.
Charlie.
Yeah, if I could come in there. I mean, you highlight that beautifully. I mean, the problem here is twofold. One is access and all the issues of access that have been talked about, and part of that is getting the trials open in the NHS. Another part of that is patients knowing that they're open in the NHS, and that will never be delivered by health providers. It will be delivered by people like you, Jeff, by charitable organisations and people like us. The NHS is bloody useless, you know, at telling even people in their own hospital there's a trial going on, let alone telling anyone there might be a trial going on in another hospital up the road for their condition. But one of the other problems we have about engagement of large numbers of patients, and I'm absolutely with you, Bruce, on this, it's an area of interest, is that we design out patients for trials all the time. The inclusion and exclusion criteria in trials have such an appalling sampling bias to a minority of people who we expect to have the best response to the treatment in question, that the majority of patients with the condition are disenfranchised from the trial with common conditions. And this happens in surgery all the time. You know, we want the perfect patients to demonstrate what a great surgeon I am. I don't want to include the person who might go wrong, you know, even though they have the condition. And until we get over that, we're going to have, you know, that is a real problem. And you can see that across large numbers of trials, the small number of patients compared to the prevalence of the condition. Look how many patients were in the trials.
Yeah, I think from my experience, one of the trials I was recruiting for, 50% of patients actually went on the trial because they didn't meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Yeah, and watching a nurse having to tell a patient with breast cancer that they can't because of those, it's a very hard conversation to have.
Just go back to your health literacy point, Vernon, and looking at sort of Joe's situation with Usher syndrome and health literacy. How do we include people with rare diseases who perhaps are going to struggle with their sides? How do we include people who have other difficulties, perhaps? Joe, how would you, have you any suggestions? How would you like, if you're being partially sighted, how do you feel? Do you feel you're excluded in any way? How do you feel in general about the trial situation?
I think it's more to do with the patient-related barriers, and it's all to do with the emotional issues, and like what we were saying before about the lack of the communication. There's probably a little bit more emphasis on, I would say, targets and deadlines and development and different drug scenarios. And I think just like the normal folk in the community would probably say something like, leave the work to the scientists in the lab, because we are just like the normal folk and we don't really understand what's happening. But we want more positive stories. And it's like the gentleman mentioned before, I feel that within the community, people are just raising excess of a couple of £100 just to raise awareness of their condition and maybe of the successes of their clinical trial. But there seems to be so much money in the pot, so to speak, that the people of the patient that I'm speaking on behalf of fear that they're not getting support money-wise as well to raise publicity and to raise more awareness of all their conditions.
Very true, very true. Mark?
Yeah, I think we've sort of touched on awareness as an issue, and I think that when people get onto a trial, it's easier for them to have that better experience because they're actually got direct connection with people. We work in a lot of areas where maybe people have a condition where they don't have regular contact with a healthcare professional, they don't get the time they need, they don't get that opportunity, those conversations, and really they're on their own to find a lot of these solutions. I think if we look at the general public, people are learning a lot more about their own health, they're doing a lot more research, they're a lot more connected to other people. And clinical trials hasn't really kind of caught up with that yet. I think we find that one of the first things we do when a client comes to us and says we need help recruiting for this trial, often that might be a trial that they've been trying for like 2 years and they're already behind trying to find patients. We'll then try and see what's the experience for a patient who wants to find out about this trial and try and get onto it. And we repeat the same exercise, and unfortunately it always seems to kind of have the same result, which is we'll go on clinicaltrials.gov, we'll find some confusing information about a trial, which might include a phone number. We'll then phone that phone number and we'll mention the trial and say, is there any way we've heard about clinical trials, we've heard about this one, could we find some more information about it? You'll get put through to a pharma company call centre who doesn't know the right department, doesn't know they do clinical trials, doesn't have any answers, and eventually you get told something along the lines of, potentially if you leave us an email, we'll maybe try and find someone to get back to you, and then maybe sort of 15 days later you get a reply which says we can't help you. And we kind of see that the entire system has been geared around recruitment directly through sites, and as patients are actively trying to find out trials that they can get involved in, as they're becoming more aware that there's options, the actual ability for patients to get engaged and get that information and participate themselves is really difficult.
I'm going to ask a question myself, which isn't actually on this list, but which is based on a personal experience I had, and I'm going to address it very, very quickly to Mark. Mark, how do you feel if your clinician recommended a clinical trial to you by email? Would you find that encouraging? And I'll tell you the reason why afterwards.
I guess it depends who they are. So I've got Crohn's disease, and I've kind of had a number of private consultants who I've emailed, and I've had specific conversations with them. If it was in that dialogue that we were having, then I'd be okay. If it was a stock email that felt like it'd been forwarded from someone else, maybe not.
What I'm actually trying to say is, if, for example, an agency had contacted your specialist and said, you have any patients who you think might be suitable, and then you get a personal email from your consultant saying, hi Mark, I think this might be of interest to you. How would that make you more or less optimistic about the potential success of the trial, whether it's suitable for you?
I think you'd certainly consider it if it came from someone that understood you and that had that experience. And I think I'd be amazed that they had the time to be able to think outside of my appointment window about things that they could help me with. I generally save my conversation for my half an hour each year I get with my consultant.
That's interesting.
And my wife and I compile the list of questions that we'd like to ask in that slot.
Has anybody else ever had that experience? Charlie, for example, have you ever felt, have you ever felt like there's a trial that you thought you knew a patient might be?
I've emailed patients, but I already knew them.
Yeah, I'm not saying randomised.
I mean, there was already a relationship. And I think in the instances where it's happened, it's because a patient said in clinic, if a trial comes along like this, could you get in touch with me? And clearly, you know, the people who I sort of prior knowledge would be okay receiving an email and understand what the email said.
Joe, was that if your clinician rang you with an email suggesting a clinical trial, is that something you'd consider? Have you had?
Yeah, it would be something I would consider, but it's like I said, the experience that people had, it's been like a very cold approach by like an email. Yeah.
I think it probably comes down to the context, doesn't it? So the context and how these things are presented makes all of the difference. You know, as you said, if it's in a trusted relationship or something pre-existing, and it feels genuine. Sometimes you can get these things and you think it's just, oh, there must be a commercial reason or something else. As long as the context is right and you're feeling like this is coming across as it's the best thing for me as a patient and it's the best thing for the condition, then I think, you know, the other thing to say is, would it be a bad thing if we just tested this with everybody and find out how many people do like it and don't? The problem sometimes is, and for good reason, we have to be a bit slow and a bit cautious, but yet we don't get the speed of testing things to find out what people really think and learn from those errors. Marketing messages go out all the time, they A/B test and they refine. How can we do that in the clinical trial space? Okay, we might annoy a few people, but might we learn more to get more people in? Maybe the greater good is an interesting thought.
So do we feel genuinely that it could be a patient-consultant relationship? I mean, Vernon, you've obviously been a doctor. You are a doctor, qualified doctor. Would you? I'll get that correct. Get it out. You are. Trust me, I'm a doctor. Do you feel there's a lot to be said about having the relationship between the patient and the doctor themselves, as to whether you're not?
A lot of behaviour change is about relationship. Absolutely, yeah. This is about those individuals. But look, we are also talking a bit in a silo. You know, Mark's talking about people being more health literate and searching online. You're at Alder Hey Centre of Excellence, you know, specialist centres. Actually, we need to democratise this, and actually the majority of people who are eligible, you know, there is this them and us. So a couple of things are, one of the best tools we have is listening to people and engaging and actioning services, information, and signposting people out there in the community through primary care, secondary care, district general hospitals, through environments that are not the specialists and the experts. That's where the majority of people are. That's where the majority of the data is. That's where the majority of the benefit to the health system is. And actually, we do some brilliant things. And I think it's easy to, well, I think we can see where some of the problems are. But actually, I'd like to turn that around a little bit and talk about some of the good things that happen. And then how do we scale that? How do we learn from that and help the other centres through networks, through groups of individuals, through champions, and activating them. People like you you're an absolute shining example, if I may, Joe, of a champion. Getting patients involved earlier in the protocol, in the study design, in the experience. We get better science, we get better evidence, and we get better results if we engage with people. But that comes back to, we need to talk to more people, more generally.
I think we're the only industry that tries to design things without involving the person it's for. I think, we're part of a consumer marketing agency, and that's my background is consumer marketing. Consumer brands get that what they're doing is all around a customer, so they first fundamentally try and understand that customer, understand what their emotional kind of challenges are, what their needs are, and then what their overall experience is, and they try and design something that works for them. They're not doing that because they fundamentally care about that person. They're doing it because they want to know the best way to sell to them. But yet, in such a critical area that we're working on, we don't apply that same science and that same rigor to how we communicate and how we get the information and the access to people in the same way that a consumer brand does.
But even thinking about that, we do want to take the best of that consumer thinking, but nobody consumes healthcare unless they're ill, unless there's a problem, unless there's so that is a fundamental issue that we need to tackle.
It's a key point, because when you're a patient, you've got no awareness of what illness you're going to have until you get it. Yep. And so then it's a skill to find the information pretty quickly. And I don't think anybody's educated enough to, because you go onto the internet and all you see is bad news stories, no matter what illness you've got. And going back to your point, the skill set of a surgeon, a professor, and that, you can't expect everybody to have that patient care. So it is key that there is sort of points of interest or places to go to for people that are scared witless, but get the right information straight away. And that helps.
From my perspective, even when patients are on trial and you have to communicate information to them, it was one of my jobs was to GDPR or how the trial had progressed or the results that were given from the trial. It was our job to just send it in the post to a patient. Now the contact information you have on the NHS system is not always up to date, so you never fully knew that the information you needed to give that patient in follow-up, or even if they just finished trial, you never knew it fully got to them. So there's a lot of a disconnect even when patients are on trial of getting the right communication to them.
Charlie.
Yeah, and the point you make is pertinent, and the disconnect between marketing in the commercial world and that in health is an interesting point. But one of the real problems that arises is we're not permitted to do what is possible in other spheres of marketing. That is, that we cannot identify people with an illness and ask them questions without ethical approval. And so we're reliant on a small group of expert patients, and no disrespect intended at all. It's great that we have expert patients, but patients who've gone the extra mile to be engaged or involved in research for their opinion of the design of our study or when we design things. The problem is that very often our study is not directed at experts. It's directed, as you said, Jeff, to the people who've only just got the illness and don't know very much about it. And we're not allowed to ask them. I can't just go and say, actually, I know it would be really helpful to have 100 patients with the disease and ask them how they would like a trial to be, but I can't do that without going through the whole rigmarole of having permission to actually contact those patients, even though I might be their doctor. And this is a major hindrance to doing anything.
But I would challenge you in a sense in the world of patient and public involvement. The whole point is to get that early involvement from day one. And that doesn't need ethical approval.
It does if you identify patients with a condition through the NHS, you have to have permission to approach them. Now, if you do it through a charitable organisation where you say you are looking for patients with a condition, but then you will get the experts and a small number of them, and they're not necessarily representative of the people who eventually you'll be directing the study at. And they won't be at scale.
And I think they don't always necessarily need to be the patient themselves either, though. You know, all patients are just people. Yeah. I think the process that Mark goes through with his team, you know, a lot of the times it's bringing out the most obvious fixes, picking up the phone, knowing where the the centres are, knowing what the clinical trial's about. All of these are such simple bits of information. You don't even need to be a patient to be able to identify those. You just need someone who's actually dedicated to go, how would I get on this trial, and identify those different points. And I think, I imagine when you talk to your clients, they're actually quite surprised that there's so many hurdles, that there's so many barriers, that there's so many simple fixes, because I don't think that happens. I think they create the design, they create the objective, and no one actually sits down and thinks, what's the process someone needs to go by? And that could just be the simplest thing in the world.
I don't know, I'm not trying to invalidate what we are doing in any way, but I'm just saying scaling that up in a sort of large marketing exercise where we really understood what everyone wanted is much more difficult in health.
Yeah, I guess it's probably the challenge if you have direct access to recruit those patients, and within the NHS there's a different construct. Certainly for us, routinely we involve patients with, and I guess it comes at the sponsor level, at that kind of global design stage where involving real patients, and I know that Alder kind of get involved in that side as well. For us, we always bring patients into that conversation. They're not people that would be eligible to then participate, and there's a separation of that, and there is process to go through. But for us, it's critical that it influences elements of the trial design. It's usually not the critical science pieces, it's the why are there 4 appointments like in the same week and we're targeting working professionals, and it's just thinking some of those simple things, and usually just mapping out the parts in the protocol, and then getting, as you say, normal people, normal patients that have lives, and actually these things need to fit around. So often we find so many things. There are definitely hurdles, but I think there's so many hurdles in the industry as a whole, and there's so many. I think the thing we always look at, I think one of the stats, that's 70% of trials across the whole industry are late recruiting. The cost, I think it was about 40 billion. There's so much, and there's so much money, and there's so much waste going across the industry globally. The effort and the expense of getting patients involved at the start and throughout, it always pays off for our clients when they do it. And I think so often there's a rush to get a trial open and get patients in, and then followed by the surprise that no one wants to join, and then followed by the rescue strategy, and then followed by the change of protocol amends, and then everything there is, I think so often for us, if we can go through a bit of that pain up front, it's always worth it in the long run.
I'm going to move on to question 5. I think we've covered most of the other ones, but question 5 is, do you think there's a role for consumer creative thinking in the sector where many are communicating directly with patients? And I'm going to direct this question to you, Bruce.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the study that I mentioned before was all about approaching people with something that was human, that appealed to them. I think time and again we've seen this, that if you think about just what is a normal message, you know, people are used to being bombarded with really high quality experiences and messages all the time. And if we then try and approach them with something which has been put together with very poor thought, you know, people won't go for it. And I think what we have to remember is actually we're competing for people's time. So we often say with our app, our competition isn't other digital data capture apps. It's Facebook or LinkedIn or, you know, Angry Birds, or it's whatever app is on the patient's home screen. We're competing with other those great experiences. And similarly, I think when we're marketing and using all of those approaches, we've got to realize they're being bombarded with these fantastic consumer brands. So unless that quality is leveled up, we're not going to be able to cut through. So I think it's absolutely critical to send.
We always find like the industry is geared around filtering out people that are lucky enough to be eligible. And the industry is designed about how do we improve the quality of the patient? How do we filter them down so they fit our criteria? And when you look at the communications, we have this analogy that we always, which is in the white paper we always use. If a sports brand was to take the same approach as a clinical trial, and it said, are you 18 to 35? Do you have feet? Our shoes may fit you. It's pretty much the sophistication that we use in clinical trials. It's like, are you the right age for us? Are you the right sex? Do you have the right condition? You may find out if you may be eligible. And there's a real lack of, I think you just touched on Joe, there's lack of empathy in that communication. It's just working out if you sort out, if you fit our criteria, not talking about what's the potential benefit, and not a medical benefit, but why would you want to be involved in a trial in the first place? What is this thing? And
I think from my experience as well, even when they go on trial and they're presented in the clinic with the patient information sheet and the consent form, they aren't attractive to look at. It's very, very hard for them to read. There could be definitely a creative consumer approach to how you communicate with those patients. So right from the start of the trial, they know what they're expecting and what they're going to be getting on that trial in an easy way, instead of reading a 30-page document that is very time-consuming.
I was just going to build on that. Really interesting you said, because for a piece of work that we're looking at in the future and some of the insights we've drawn, one centres around consent forms, and that whole consumer approach has definitely got a place in solving some of those problems. So one of the problems that we've identified is with a consent form, there's kind of two ways that a patient is interpreting it, and it's either that it feels like a contract, a binding contract, and if they are to sign it, they're locked in to whatever they committed to, and that brings up an extra barrier of resistance to the clinical trial. And the other side to that is that that patient may feel it's just a formality, and they will just sign it. Now the problem to that is that later down the line, they'll have a diminished experience because they probably don't understand the protocol and exactly what they've signed up for. And then that can cause all kinds of problems for the company themselves if they start to deviate from that protocol and the patient starts to flag it because that consent hasn't been done in a good way. And I think that we can take lessons from the consumer industry. They're very good at the human element, the emotive element, to try and improve even those legal documentation so that it communicates better with the patient.
Do you think that would help with regard to recruiting children for clinical trials?
I mean, the patient information sheets for children's trials are absolutely abysmal, because all they do is actually just develop the adult patient information sheet and then drop it down a few years, then drop it down a few years again, and then it's absolutely atrocious. So for the last 14 years, our young people have been saying, where's the multimedia interventions? Why aren't we having this in an app? Why can't we? And, you know, we have to realise that that patient information sheet is just a guide to have a conversation and, you know, so that it's informed consent, assent in the case of younger children, but it's just still poor for young people.
But you're saying something is so important, that this is about a conversation. So we've talked a lot about pushing information to get somebody to do something. Right person, tick a box, get them on a trial. But everything we've been doing, this is about engaging, it's a dialogue. Now, you mentioned ethics committee or the compliance, so we put everything on a sheet. We talk about all the risks and we get everything out there because it's a legal, conservative approach to legality and making sure it's all there. Does the person engage with all of that? Do they understand what the risks are or the not risks? Can they filter that info? That requires a conversation and it requires that sophistication. Sometimes I think we need to be more careful about what's a supporting piece of information versus what's a dialogue and a discussion. Once somebody's digested something, are they coming back with questions? How do we move them along? And because we see people infrequently, we can provide them with better navigation, better information hierarchy, better navigation to different places that are curated and syndicated, that are high quality. We see so much waste and replication and repetition. Right? We see it from the different groups and everybody's creating their own things. Actually, shouldn't there be better standards and harmonisation of some of these pieces of information and services?
Jeff, have you got any views on that? I saw you nodding there.
No, I just think it is purely communication. I think years ago there'd be a clinician up in Newcastle doing exactly the same thing as somebody down in London and banging their heads against the same problem. Without communication, we don't move forward. And I think, like you say, it's a waste of resource, it's a waste of money and a waste of time. And we have to find a way where there is, you've said it with an app, that's the way forward now. Anybody who's got an iPhone or any phone, or they go home on the internet, they need just a simple click message process. And I think we've got the ability of doing it, but unfortunately people aren't backing it financially to get it done.
And it's interesting how, the technology, in my view, is not the barrier, is the will and wanting to use the technology. It's out there. It's interesting somehow, sometimes I think you kind of referred to it, the ethics committee requirements to produce all the materials up front and before you get the ethical approval, you have to have everything. But actually in the modern day, you need to be able to iterate and change. And I wonder how much that is going to hold back many people from wanting to, reinvent the wheel or get the patient feedback and improve things because they think, oh, well, maybe we have to go back to ethics again. Maybe a clearer separation of this sort of stuff would help because, when it's not the consent form, it's the other supporting information, perhaps being freer with that would be helpful.
I think from my experience, one of the trials I opened just shortly before I left the Christie, an amendment came through where they wanted to add a Facebook ad for patients to be recruited, and they would go through and speak to somebody to see if they were eligible to then be passed to the clinician. And within the environment I worked at, it was just unheard. It was like, can we do this? Is this actually possible? Will it get through ethics? And it did get through ethics, but as a team, we couldn't get our head around. Can someone actually be referred to a specialist site without having to go through a primary care physician, without having that have to be passed to the specialist? And they couldn't grasp the idea. So I think there is need to be a perception change where people within these centres can see the use of technology to recruit patients to these trials.
Jenny.
I think having sat on an ethics committee for 10 years, I think the problem lies with not with the patient information sheet, for example, is once you've received that, it's far too late in the system to change. It's the protocol. So it goes back to what you were saying, is if you've got patients involved and a good representative patient group involved in the design and the simulation of that protocol prior to it going to ethics committee, you're more than likely to have a boxed off trial that is suitable for the patients who want to take part. And I don't think ethics committees are reluctant to, I think they are coming round to change and multimedia interventions. I mean, I haven't sat on it for 10 years and I've left it about 2 years ago. When I first started and we were getting 27-page information sheets for young people, and we still do see that now, and they were saying, yeah, but it's not in the standard layout. And you said, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be. It's an assent form. It's 27 pages long. Where's the assent? Where's the informed consent in that documentation? Oh, right, okay. Can't it be like this, what the young people are saying? Can't it have colour on it? Can't it? And so it was that 10 years of change in people's mindset. So now, when I'm talking multimedia interventions, they're saying, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. But get it in there, that's what the patients want. That's what the patients want, and that's what they're demanding. Yep. On that question 14 in your IRIS application, get it in there to say you've consulted with a group of patients in the protocol design, in the various stages, and this is what they want, and justify what you've done to prove that.
You've said it beautifully there, Jenny. It's what matters most to the patients and to the individuals involved. That's what the health system is there to provide, the service for the patients.
I might add that there is a dichotomy of opinion often between the patients, the ethics committee and the sponsor of studies in terms of this. And I mean, Bruce will know this well, and I've done studies with e-consent and remote outcomes. The future lies in patients putting their outcomes in at home and consenting online, undoubtedly. But do you see a future where a CTIMP study can be done without patients coming back for visits?
No, I think there will always be studies that will be completely site-based, because you have to come in.
Don't necessarily need to be, but
there'll be some where you have to be.
The risk adversity, it's the problem of risk adversity. And I'll give you an example of, just coming back to what you said. We had a poster for a study. It was nice and colourful, straightforward. Patients designed it. The ethics committee threw it out because they didn't like it. It was designed by patients. And to go back and make a change in the poster requires going back to the ethics. It's patient-facing. It's crazy. I mean, we have to get around this.
I think you can challenge the ethics committee and say, what is ethically wrong with that poster? And that's what you can. And I deliver training for the Health Research Authority in children and in children's trials, and say you have a right to challenge that agreement, because most of the time with your retired lay professors on the committees, they are stickler for rules. But actually you can challenge them and say, what is the ethical reason for not accepting this documentation? If it's been designed by the patient. So I think some people are scared to challenge it because of the delay it's going to cause to the actual approval process.
I think if you mention the word committee, it's just a slowing down of the process anyway, isn't it?
I mean, you see people coming into the ethics committee and they're absolutely petrified.
The thing is that they've got to stick their necks out and to change something, and they've got their name associated with change. And if it doesn't work, they're scared of failure, and they don't want to have their name attached to anything that's failing. And that's why we're slow, we're sluggish in the NHS, because I was speaking to somebody who was in charge of a trust, and they were saying about somebody else got in charge of this other trust that was failing, and never have they done anything that was pushing the boundaries. All they did, never did anything wrong in their career. That's why they got that role in such an important post, that they've not done anything wrong, but they've not done anything to change anything. And that's what's the stumbling block within NHS. We're scared of making change.
Yeah, and I think this kind of, lots of discussion has been very UK-centric. But you know, we're all patients across the world. You know, most of our work is outside of the UK. Things go a lot quicker in some other countries. The US IRBs, the Institutional Review Board, the Ethics Committee equivalent, sometimes these things go through very quickly. And of course, many trials are global. You know, the UK just has a number of sites in a 20-country study. So I think as the UK, we've got to be quicker, got to keep up with others, use the best of what we've got in the UK, and maybe there are some things where we can keep pushing ahead. But I think this is critical. If we don't tackle those things, we'll fall behind. Research will go elsewhere, and which won't be good for the UK, but it won't be good for those patients, as we were saying, who want to be on the studies.
But this is a massive missed opportunity. We've got 70 million people that are plugged into one of the most trusted health systems on the planet. For whatever any detractors might say, when you look at the raft of outcomes from quality, clinical, cost effectiveness, experience, the NHS is world class. And we have 70 million people part of that system that could be generating the best evidence base for improving not just the NHS, but providing that to other health systems as part of that system. And part of that is about getting that sea change, the culture change that you mentioned. That is, we're all part of that, and we're all part of that learning process, and that's part of that sort of cultural contract, for want of a better word, of being part of the health system.
I think the time is ripe for that cultural change as well. Not only do we have those technological advances available to us now where we can be more targeted, where we can connect people not just within the UK but all around the world, but we're also running out of time not to change. You know, if you look at the number of clinical trials that we've got, the cost per clinical trial, and if you look at the pressures that are going on within our healthcare system and healthcare system around the world, you know, we're running out of time not to make these changes. You can liken it to your Netflix and your Blockbuster. You know, if you don't make those changes, we're going to become irrelevant very quickly, as you say. We need to be thinking about the Netflix way of approaching clinical trials and doing that rapidly.
Right, time is not on our side at the moment. So I'm going to go around the room and I'm going to ask you what single technology or advance do you think will change how we improve the patient experience in clinical trials? I'm going to start with Preston. I'm going to go around the room, and I think by then we might have run out of time. But Christian.
So I'm going to pick just an advance, not an actual technology, but a lot of what we've spoken about today is talking about this human element and a disconnect between the clinical study and then actually the human variable. And so the advance for me lies in where that might stem from. So when I think about clinical trials and where it comes from, that we're sticklers for certain, especially with ethical committee, they're not willing to move. It probably comes from the fact, all right, well, where do clinical investigations start? Well, they start entrenched in legislation and regulation. Now, the people charged with coming up with these studies have to make sure that everything's right in print, okay? So it's very black and white. And they don't like variables that they can't control. Now, all of a sudden, once that study's in place, you're introducing an extra variable, that human variable, to that clinical trial. Now, it's very difficult for people to change pace. So they're thinking in one way, very logical, very on the line, very black and white, and all of a sudden they have to try and adopt this mindset of empathy and putting themselves into the position of humans, and probably they're not the best people to do it because their job's to do something very different. So the advance for me is simply that people within clinical trials whose job it is to make sure the regulation and legislation is correct aren't the people then to start to build into the human element of that. It's important that they do it because of the regulation, we can believe the science. It keeps people safe, but we need to start to recognise that we're then not the best people to understand how a trial can be patient-centric, and we need to bring in other people.
Thank you. Bernard, very quickly, your...
Right. I'm going to use the quote from William Gibson, the writer, science fiction writer. The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. That's 25 years old, that quote. Bruce. We've got the technologies, we just need to get it in the right people's hands at the right time.
Probably built on that, 1/4 of the clinical trials run capture electronic patient-reported outcomes. The advance is going to be seeing that go to 100% of studies, capturing data about patients, but using their own devices. Not having to give them devices, not having to spend all that money, not giving them paper, using people's technology in their pocket.
Lucy?
I think advancing technology within the centres and around the world to make sure that that data can be captured and used effectively and the technology doesn't fail, which was my experience with using wearable technology for patients.
Fantastic. Jeff?
I just think now the technology is there to have a one place to go to when you're diagnosed with an illness, where you can find the best treatment and the best. If there's clinical trials, you find out where it's going on.
Thank you. Jenny?
Using technology to connect patients, to talk to each other in support systems.
All right, that's a lot. Mark?
For me, what's missing is collaboration with patients, researchers, sponsors, technology, industry working together to solve the problems rather than working in silo.
Claire?
Not technology, but an advancement. It would be to change the way that we create the objective of the clinical trial. At the moment, gold standard clinical trial is that 50% of patients are on placebo and fail. We should be creating trials that 100% of patients succeed.
Yep. Charlie?
I'll be quick. I'll say the same technology as Bruce, electronic patient-reported outcomes.
And finally, Joe?
Yeah, and more engagement, again, technology, that's where people are, like online forums, that kind of thing, where people do talk, they have like numerous discussions on social media. We might not like it, but thousands of people are discussing over the clinical trial, patient engagement. There's definitely technology, and being more involved in community supportive network.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I've certainly enjoyed it. Thank you very much for coming. Good night.
Thank you.